For Paul, the purpose of Christ's redemptive work was to set God's creation free from the curse of Eden.
Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here.
Those in Christ were new creations, freed from the bondage of sin and its expression in human relationships. In the new humanity created in Christ, the culturally and religiously ingrained view that some human beings, on the basis of gender or race or social status, were in some sense inferior could no longer be maintained. It was surely one of Paul's central theological convictions. In discussing the passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verses 33 to 40, where Paul instructs women in the church to remain silent, we saw that this restriction was not universally applied either by Paul or by other early congregations. Women functioned in prominent leadership positions. Phoebe, Lydia, Euodia, Syntyche, Priscilla, Eunia were designated as ministers or deacons, fellow workers, collaborators in the gospel, apostles or messengers. The Spirit of God empowered both men and women to be proclaimers of God's redemptive work in Christ. Women's participation in the edifying presentation of the gospel and vocal prayer in the congregation were a normal part of early church life. In light of the above considerations, reasons for the particular restriction imposed on women in Timothy's congregation must be discovered from within the text and the situation in the church which Paul addresses. If, as we have seen, a curtailed role for women was neither a part of the divine intention in creation nor a normative aspect of the redeemed order, then the curtailment of their speaking and teaching and leading in 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2 must be in response to critical, local situations. Investigation of 1 Corinthians 14 revealed such a crisis setting in Corinth. A critical situation in the life and faith of Timothy's congregation seems likewise the reason for Paul's instruction here. Upon reading 1 Timothy, one becomes immediately aware that the integrity of the Christian faith is at stake. There are some in the church who teach false doctrines, and are occupied with myths and other speculative ideas, which militate against sound and sincere faith.
As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command a certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. Such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith.
Some have wandered into vain debates, seeking to be teachers without understanding and discernment.
Some have departed from these and have turned to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they are talking about, or what they so confidently affirm.
There is throughout a concern for maintaining and guarding the truth of the faith. We do not know the identity of the false teachers or the full content of their teaching. From the instructions given, we can conclude that the false teaching led to a disregard for proper decorum and practices in the church, as well as to a rejection of the institution of marriage.
They forbid people to marry and order them to abstain from certain foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and who know the truth.
In light of this last aspect of the heretical teaching, it is noteworthy that particular attention is directed to young widows in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verses 9 to 15, who are urged to marry, have children and manage their homes.
So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander.
When these normal, socially prescribed roles and functions are neglected or rejected, these women are prone to gossiping and being busybodies, saying things they ought not to.
Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to.
On the basis of this data, at least two reconstructions of the situation in Timothy's congregation at Ephesus are possible. 1. The women in the church at Ephesus were the primary advocates and promoters of the heretical teachings, which were upsetting accepted patterns of congregational and home life. 2. The women in the church had been particularly influenced by the heretical teachers. Such a situation in the Ephesian church is addressed in 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 6 to 9, where women, the special targets of those who oppose the truth, become unable to acknowledge the truth. In either case, Paul's restrictive word in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 to 12 must be understood within a context where false teaching is at issue. The general prohibition against all those who teach false doctrines is now focused specifically on the women who have fallen prey to such false teaching, or who are involved in its promulgation. The admonition of 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 11, "Learn in quietness and full submission," is thus directed at the women who, on the basis of the heretical teaching, have become loud voices, strident advocates of ideas that are upsetting the ordered contexts of congregational and home life. The submission enjoined on them is most likely a submission to the elders in the church, who are guardians of the truth and ordered worship. The prohibition against their teaching is occasioned by their involvement in false teachings. Finally, the prohibition against authority over a man must be understood within the context of their rejection of the authority of others, probably the male leaders in Ephesus, whose orthodox, authoritative teaching is being undermined by their heretical views. The unusual Greek word used carries primarily the negative sense of grasping for or usurping authority. Thus, the restriction of women's place and participation in the life and ministry of the church at Ephesus is most probably directed against women involved in false teaching, who have abused proper exercise of authority in the church. Not denied by Paul elsewhere to women. By usurpation and domination of the male leaders and teachers in the church at Ephesus. Paul goes on to ground this instruction in reflections on selected passages from Genesis,